It was early morning in a makeshift prisoner-of-war camp in northern France, late 1944. Mist clung to the muddy grounds where rows of wooden barracks stretched toward the horizon, the scent of damp earth mixed with the faint aroma of cooked rations, a reminder that sustenance, scarce and precious, was the first concern of the day. Inside one of the larger compounds, German prisoners shuffled forward, eyes wary, hands clasped behind their backs. Guards in crisp American uniforms moved among them, distributing trays and checking attendance. The atmosphere was tense, yet oddly controlled. A fragile order maintained amid uncertainty. Then came the moment that would linger in memory. Without ceremony, the American officers instructed the prisoners to take their portions first. For men accustomed to scarcity and hierarchy imposed by harsh circumstances, the directive was unexpected. Forks paused mid-air. Eyes widened. Whispers spread through the rows of tents. For the prisoners, it was not just a meal. It was a gesture that contradicted every expectation of enemy conduct. The guards, disciplined and calm, stood aside, allowing the men to eat before themselves. The shock etched across faces, the tentative acceptance of food, and the cautious gratitude created a brief, almost surreal pause in the grim rhythm of captivity. In that simple act, the rules of the camp and the boundaries of war itself shifted, if only for a moment. The scene captured both the humanity and discipline of those enforcing it and the disbelief and curiosity of those receiving it. It was a small act, yet its impact resonated far beyond the breakfast tables of that quiet morning. By late 1944, the tide of the Second World War in Western Europe had firmly turned. Allied forces were advancing steadily across France and into Germany, liberating towns and capturing large numbers of Axis soldiers. The rapid collapse of German front lines meant that the Allies faced an unprecedented logistical and humanitarian challenge, processing, securing, and caring for tens of thousands of prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, particularly the 1929 regulations regarding the treatment of POWs, provided a legal framework. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, given sufficient food, shelter, and medical care, and protected from acts of reprisal. Yet compliance varied widely in practice, influenced by supply constraints, local conditions, and the attitudes of guards and commanders. The United States, committed to demonstrating discipline and morality, emphasized adherence to these standards, integrating them into daily camp operations. Establishing camps capable of handling large numbers of prisoners required meticulous planning. Barracks had to be constructed or repurposed, sanitation maintained, and guards assigned to enforce order while respecting international law. Daily routines, roll calls, work assignments, meal distribution were structured to ensure security without provoking unrest. Supply lines, stretched across liberated territories, were carefully coordinated to deliver food, clothing, and medical provisions, though shortages and delays occasionally forced improvisation. For prisoners, life in the camps oscillated between monotony and tension. They were confined, often in overcrowded conditions, with limited access to news and external contact. Rations were predictable but measured, exercise was limited, and personal space scarce. Guards maintained authority through a mix of discipline and procedural oversight, relying on order rather than intimidation alone. This approach fostered compliance, but also created opportunities for small acts of humanity, gestures that could profoundly affect the psychological state of the prisoners. The broader context also reflected the strategic realities of the Allied advance. With front lines moving rapidly, camp administrators had to balance security with the practical need to manage large groups efficiently. Humanitarian measures, including careful attention to food distribution and the fair treatment of prisoners, were not merely ethical considerations, they were essential for maintaining order and preventing unrest that could disrupt broader military objectives. In this environment, the seemingly simple act of allowing prisoners to eat first was far from trivial. It was embedded within a framework of legal obligations, logistical planning, and psychological strategy. What might appear as a small concession was, in fact, the product of deliberate policy and a reflection of the values guiding Allied military administration. The operation of prisoner of war camps in late 1944 was a complex orchestration of logistics, security, and humanitarian responsibility. American guards were trained not only in maintaining order, but in observing the regulations of the Geneva Convention, which required that prisoners be treated with dignity and provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care. This legal framework dictated many aspects of daily life in the camps, from the distribution of rations to the management of barracks. Food distribution was a particularly sensitive task. With thousands of prisoners under care, camp administrators had to ensure that supplies were sufficient, equitable, and efficiently delivered. Meals were planned in advance, often relying on military field rations supplemented by local provisions. Guards were responsible for maintaining order during mealtimes, preventing disputes, and monitoring compliance. Despite the disciplined structure, small deviations, like allowing prisoners to eat before guards, required careful oversight and command authorization. Morale and human behavior were crucial factors. Officers recognized that prisoners' reactions could influence camp stability. Starvation, overcrowding, or perceived mistreatment risked unrest or resistance. Conversely, gestures of fairness and controlled generosity could foster compliance and reduce tension. Allowing prisoners to eat first was not a random act. It was a calculated measure designed to maintain psychological equilibrium, uphold ethical standards, and demonstrate American discipline in adherence to international law. For German officers and enlisted men, the adjustment was stark. Accustomed to hierarchical structures and strict discipline, even in captivity, the unexpected precedence given to their needs created cognitive dissonance. Witnessing guards step aside, supervising without interference, and allowing them first access to sustenance challenged both expectations and assumptions about enemy conduct. It was a subtle yet profound lesson in the practical application of humanitarian principles within a wartime environment. Additionally, the broader operational context shaped the decision. American forces, advancing deep into Europe, were simultaneously engaged in frontline combat, logistics, and civil administration. The treatment of prisoners served not only ethical objectives, but strategic ones. Disciplined, well-fed prisoners were less likely to resist, easier to process, and reflected favorably on American conduct in the eyes of both international observers and local populations. This careful balance of operational necessity, moral obligation, and psychological insight created the environment for the pivotal moment. When prisoners were finally allowed to take their rations first, it was more than a gesture. It was the culmination of planning, policy, and human understanding, setting the stage for the reactions that would define the morale and behavior within the camp. For the German prisoners, the simple act of being allowed to eat first carried profound significance. Decades of military training and cultural conditioning had taught them to expect harsh treatment from an enemy and strict discipline even in captivity. In the early moments, disbelief mixed with cautious curiosity. Some hesitated, unsure whether this was a trap or a test. Others glanced at their fellow prisoners, seeking silent confirmation that it was permissible to proceed. The first bites were tentative. Faces that had known hunger and fear now registered surprise and, in some cases, relief. For many, this was the first gesture of consideration from the captors, and it subtly shifted the atmosphere in the camp. The human response was not just physical satisfaction. It was emotional, a quiet acknowledgement of unexpected civility amidst the backdrop of war. Angle 2. Moral and ethical perspective. The decision to allow prisoners to eat before the guards was grounded in moral and legal principles. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment and equitable provision of food. By adhering to these standards, the American guards demonstrated discipline and ethical consistency. This act illustrated that adherence to law and morality was not only possible in wartime, but could be operationalized effectively, even under logistical pressures. The moral dimension extended beyond legality. It reinforced the principle that dignity in treatment, even of an enemy, could coexist with security and military objectives. Officers who authorized the policy understood that ethical action could yield practical benefits, maintaining order while setting an example of principled conduct. Angle 3. Leadership and command decisions. From a leadership perspective, the moment reflected careful planning and foresight. Camp commanders had to weigh multiple factors: prisoner morale, guard discipline, potential risks, and the perception of authority. Allowing prisoners first access to food required clear instructions, supervision, and contingency planning to ensure compliance and prevent disorder. The action highlighted the difference between authoritarian control and disciplined, humane leadership. By maintaining authority while extending measured courtesy, commanders fostered respect and minimized tension. Their leadership decisions created a structured environment in which compliance was achieved not through intimidation, but through calculated fairness. Distributing food in a POW camp was not merely a routine task. It required careful coordination to prevent conflict and ensure efficiency. The number of prisoners, limited supplies, and constraints of space and staffing meant that timing, supervision, and organization were crucial. Allowing prisoners to eat first was integrated into a controlled system. Guards monitored cues, maintained order, and ensured that no group received preferential treatment beyond the sanctioned gesture. This approach demonstrated how humanitarian measures could coexist with operational efficiency. By planning meals with precision, commanders reduced the risk of unrest and avoided bottlenecks that could compromise security. In effect, tactical planning extended beyond combat to encompass human management, a testament to the broader scope of military leadership in wartime. Angle 5. Cultural and psychological impact. The cultural expectations of German soldiers, shaped by years of military hierarchy and strict obedience, made the gesture of precedence especially striking. Many prisoners were trained to anticipate harsh treatment, retaliation, or at best, indifferent supervision. Being allowed to eat first created a psychological dissonance: surprise, confusion, and eventually gratitude. This act subtly altered behavior and perception. Prisoners who might have been suspicious or resistant became more compliant and cooperative, recognizing the professionalism and fairness of their captors. The incident became a psychological anchor, demonstrating that even in war, gestures of respect could profoundly influence human behavior. Angle 6. Historical significance. While small in scale, the event reflected broader historical trends in Allied treatment of prisoners. It illustrated the practical application of Geneva Convention principles and the emphasis on discipline, morality, and order. Documentation and testimonies from similar camps confirmed that humane treatment was not only an ethical mandate, but a strategic tool, reinforcing stability and reducing the potential for violence or escape. This moment, though simple, serves as a window into the intersection of law, humanity, and operational discipline during the final phases of the European War. It set a precedent for post-war evaluations of military conduct and highlighted the potential for small acts of civility to shape morale, behavior, and perception on both sides of the conflict. The pivotal moment unfolded at mid-morning in one of the larger compounds of the camp. The prisoners, lined up in rigid rows, had come to expect the usual routine: guards first, then their own meager portions. Instead, the commanding officer signaled a deviation from the norm. With measured authority, he instructed the guards to allow the prisoners to take their rations before anyone else. A hush fell over the compound. German soldiers exchanged glances, some skeptical, some cautiously intrigued. Forks hovered, hands trembled slightly from both hunger and disbelief. For the guards, the action was routine, a planned, approved procedure. But for the prisoners, it was an unexpected concession that upended their expectations of enemy conduct. The first men moved forward. Trays, laden with hot rations, were handed to them without interruption. Observing this, others followed hesitantly, slowly gaining confidence. Officers in the prisoner ranks maintained order, ensuring that the line moved smoothly. Yet, the surprise on their faces was unmistakable. This brief interval, where fear and suspicion gave way to cautious acceptance, encapsulated the human drama at the heart of the event. American guards maintained discipline, circulating among the rows, ready to intervene if necessary, yet giving space for the prisoners to proceed unimpeded. The scene illustrated an essential principle. Authority exercised with controlled fairness could create order, even in situations historically fraught with tension. By the end of the serving period, nearly every prisoner had received his meal, seated or standing in a rare moment of relief. The guards then ate their own portions, maintaining the structured rhythm of camp life, but the impact had already registered. For the prisoners, the memory of that morning, the trust, the unexpected consideration, would linger far beyond the confines of the barracks. The event, though seemingly small, crystallized the broader theme of the camp: that discipline, humanity, and planning could intersect to produce a decisive psychological and moral outcome. The consequences, both immediate and enduring, would shape interactions and perceptions within the camp for weeks to follow. In the hours following the meal, the effects of the morning's gesture became increasingly evident. Prisoners moved with a newfound composure, the initial shock giving way to cautious confidence. German officers noted the orderly conduct and absence of complaints or unrest, contrasting sharply with previous experiences in captivity where food distribution often sparked tension or dispute. Camp records and guard reports from that period highlight the psychological impact. Prisoners who had been suspicious or defensive now complied willingly with instructions, maintained discipline during roll calls, and engaged with camp routines more consistently. The act of precedence in the meal did not undermine authority. Instead, it reinforced respect for the guards' structured leadership. From a leadership perspective, the commanding officer's decision exemplified strategic foresight. Allowing prisoners to eat first mitigated potential friction, reduced stress on both guards and captives, and created an environment conducive to operational stability. Observers later noted that such measures contributed significantly to the overall efficiency and security of the camp. The event also underscored the moral dimension of wartime command. Adherence to the Geneva Convention was not merely procedural. It was a tool for sustaining order, maintaining morale, and demonstrating the ethical standards of the American military. For the prisoners, the experience left a lasting impression. Their captors, though armed and authoritative, chose discipline and fairness over arbitrary dominance. By afternoon, routine resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Prisoners approached their duties and interactions with guards with increased trust, while guards maintained authority tempered by measured civility. The "eat first" moment became a defining memory within the camp, a quiet turning point that exemplified how small, deliberate acts could resonate far beyond their immediate context. This convergence of psychological insight, moral principle, and operational discipline would shape subsequent interactions, forming the foundation for a stable and humane camp environment as the war neared its final phases. In the days following the precedent-setting meal, the camp settled into a rhythm of controlled efficiency. German prisoners displayed marked changes in behavior. Compliance increased. Disputes over rations or space diminished. And officers reported smoother coordination among enlisted men. The initial surprise had evolved into cautious acceptance, establishing a baseline of trust and predictability within the camp. American guards and camp administrators observed the practical benefits immediately. By demonstrating disciplined fairness, they reduced potential friction, minimized incidents of resistance, and reinforced the authority of the camp command without relying on intimidation. Logistical operations, meal distribution, sanitation, and roll calls proceeded more smoothly, allowing staff to focus on larger administrative tasks such as processing new arrivals and maintaining security. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate compliance. Prisoners internalized the message that humane treatment was a consistent policy rather than an ad hoc concession. Historical reports from multiple POW camps in late 1944 and early 1945 note that gestures aligned with Geneva Convention principles fostered calm and reduced the need for punitive measures. In effect, the act of allowing prisoners to eat first became a model for the broader administration of POWs, demonstrating the tangible benefits of ethical conduct under military discipline. For the prisoners, this period offered a subtle but meaningful shift in perception. Men accustomed to harsh treatment or unpredictable authority now faced captors who enforced order with fairness and restraint. Letters and memoirs written by German POWs after the war often reference such moments, describing a mixture of disbelief, respect, and quiet gratitude. These small acts of civility did not erase the reality of captivity, but they mitigated fear, fostered cooperation, and contributed to the overall stability of the camp environment. From a strategic standpoint, the success of these measures validated the American approach to POW management. Ethical treatment aligned with operational efficiency. By combining discipline, foresight, and humanity, camp authorities ensured both security and adherence to international law, creating an environment in which both captor and captive could function with predictable order. In the weeks that followed, the precedent of allowing prisoners to eat first was reinforced and expanded across other compounds in the camp. Commanders implemented clear protocols to ensure consistent treatment, integrating lessons learned from the initial event. Roll calls, work assignments, and mealtimes were all structured to uphold fairness while maintaining security. The result was a smoother operational environment with fewer incidents of conflict or resistance among prisoners. Historical records from the U.S. Army detail the broader implications. Camps that adhered closely to Geneva Convention standards reported lower rates of disciplinary infractions and improved prisoner cooperation. The psychological effect of predictable, humane treatment reduced stress among both prisoners and guards, allowing officers to focus on administrative and logistical priorities rather than constant enforcement or crisis management. The act also left an indelible impression on German POWs. In letters and post-war testimonies, many recalled the morning they were allowed to eat first as a moment of unexpected civility. For some, it challenged preconceptions about their captors and contributed to a grudging respect for the professionalism and moral discipline of the American military. These accounts highlight that even small gestures, when implemented consistently and fairly, can influence morale, behavior, and perceptions over time. Strategically, the successful integration of ethical practices within camp management offered lessons for both contemporaneous and future military operations, demonstrating that humanitarian measures could coexist with operational discipline, reinforced the credibility of the U.S. Army, both in the eyes of the prisoners and the international community. It showcased that the exercise of authority need not rely solely on coercion, but could also harness principles of fairness and structured humanity to achieve stability. In the long term, the camp became a model of orderly POW management. The combination of adherence to law, psychological insight, and logistical precision ensured that the environment remained controlled, humane, and efficient. The event of that first mealtime, in which prisoners were allowed to eat before the guards, resonated far beyond its immediate context, symbolizing the practical and moral advantages of principled leadership during wartime.